Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a wonderful little book or treatise that I just finished reading. This is written by Gregory of Nazianzus, one of the early church fathers, one of the Cappadocian fathers. I'll talk more about him and his bio here in a minute. But this is his very famous short work. It's actually an oration, so kind of like a sermon or a talk that he would have given. Oration number 2. It's called In Defense of His Flight to Pontus. And there's actually a longer title which will help to orient you to what this oration is about. In defense of his flight to Pontus and his return after his ordination to the priesthood, with an exposition of the character of the priestly office. So this is found in volume 7 of the second series in the Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, the Schaff set. This is freely available online. If you look at CCEL online, you can find it there. I have this set that was given to me that I have been dipping into here and there, and have really enjoyed getting to read a bit of Gregory of Nazianzen. So let me orient you to who Gregory is and how his biography helps us to understand this particular work that I want to review with you today. So Gregory of Nazianzen, as I said, is one of the early church fathers. He lived in the 4th century, so the 300s AD, living in a context where Christianity has become the first legal and then official religion of the Roman Empire, both in the East and in the West, and in a time where there's this great flourishing and flowering of Christian theology, because no longer is Christianity a persecuted minority. It's now something that is working its way through the Roman Empire, even more than it had in its first 3 centuries. However, as Christianity becomes more popular and promoted, you also have more compromise, right? If you are a Christian in the 2nd century or the 3rd century under Diocletian or something, and you're being persecuted for your faith, there tends to be people are there because they're committed. But once you move into the 4th century, it's a whole different pastoral dynamic. There's different theological controversies, and those theological controversies take on an extra layer of meaning because it's no longer a dispute within the church, but as the church becomes more influential and powerful, those theological and churchly disputes have ripples and ramifications for culture, politics as a whole. There is no separation of church and state in people's thinking in this mind or in practice. And so these discussions and debates about the deity of the Son or the relationship between the human and divine natures in Christ, these are things that are not just for kind of egghead theologians to discuss. They're things that have tremendous impact on culture as a whole. And Gregory of Nazianzen has earned the title of Gregory the Theologian because he is widely recognized, both in his own day and ever since, as being someone who was particularly helpful to the church in thinking through and working through those tricky theological questions. He's one of, as I said, the Cappadocian fathers, Gregory of Nazianzen, and then the 2 brothers, Gregory of Nyssa and Basil of Caesarea. And Gregory himself was someone who was very much theologically minded. He studied and lived in a monastery for a time, gave himself to what he would call philosophy, the study or pursuit or love of wisdom, and wrote extensively on the different things that were debated in his day. He's most famous for his book, The 5 Theological Orations, which deal with Trinitarian issues, nature of Christ, relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And that was a work that both sealed his reputation as a defender of orthodoxy and also made him an object of attack by the heretics, especially the Arians. So much so that I was reading in the introduction to this, and they were talking about Gregory's life, that apparently at one point some Arians hired an assassin to try and kill Gregory of Nazianzen. I presume they did not carry out that mission, but as you can tell, there are very high stakes here. But the work that we have before us today, the second oration, is not primarily theological in the way that his other works might be. It's something that's more very much pastoral and very much practical. And to understand it, you need to know a little bit about Gregory's story. So, as I mentioned, Gregory was a great Orthodox theologian, and he grew up in a Christian family. His father, who was also named Gregory, was brought up in kind of a strange cult that tried to meld together Judaism and Christianity and some of these different superstitions and things. And he was actually converted to Orthodox Christianity by the woman that would become his wife. And after he was converted, he became a minister, a bishop at the church in their area. They had several children. Gregory Jr., Gregory of Nazianzus, as we know him, was the youngest of the three kids, and brought up again in that Christian household with a father who was a minister, very much inclined towards study, reflection, theology. And he was someone who was quick to go to his books, quick to go to prayer, less oriented towards people, I think we might say. So he's not like, Basil of Caesarea, one of the other Cappadocians that he would kind of work alongside, is very much a model administrator, as well as being a good theologian. And Gregory of Nazianzus doesn't have that same bent. He has to develop that a little bit more. And that becomes relevant for the context to this work, because what happened was Gregory of Nazianzus' father, Gregory Sr., we might say, was getting on in years, and also looking at his son and thinking that his son would be a good pastor. He could see the skills there, he could see the abilities there, and he was also seeing his own need for help, both in ministry and just in life as he and his wife were aging. And so he kind of conspired with the local church to say, hey, we should bring on my son to work alongside me. And the congregation was very enthusiastic about that. So they call Gregory of Nazianzus to serve as their pastor, to serve as their local priest in Christmas of 361 AD. Gregory was at the time living in a monastery with St. Basil of Caesarea, studying, praying, doing all the things he loved, and he gets called away from that to become the priest of this local church. He is not excited about that. In fact, he is very overwhelmed by the prospect and speaks of it as a tyranny being imposed upon him. And so shortly after kind of being installed as the priest in Christmas of 361, he flees back to Pontus, where he had been, back to his books, back to his prayer, away from the life of the church to the monastery. And as you can imagine, that causes all sorts of turmoil with his father, with the congregation, and in his own soul. And by Easter of 362, he has decided to return to the church and take up the duties of serving as a pastor, as a minister. But as you can imagine, the church there is very cool towards him, and there's a very low turnout on Easter Day when he returns in 362. And so, all that is the context, he writes this oration, the second oration, which is a defense, an explanation of why it is he ran away. Why did he go back to Pontus? And in doing that, what he's doing is kind of locally, he's trying to explain what was going through his mind, what motivated him to leave, what motivated him to return. And as he's doing that, really the answer he gives is it was the ministry itself that was so weighty and so overwhelming that I wasn't sure I could do it. And so this oration is not just kind of a personal explanation of why he left, but it's an exploration of what it means to be a priest, what it means to be a minister or a pastor. And that is kind of the exploring of that is what gives the context for his actions to his local church. So this is a book that is obviously of interest historically. It's a fascinating story and kind of window into Gregory of Nazianzus' life, but its significance is more in how it helped the church to think through what it means to be a pastor. Because if you are familiar with the history of the Christian church, and I've got an interest in this book both because I'm a pastor, so it's very relevant for my own calling and to think about, but also academically, I've done a little bit of work. I wrote some articles for Banner of Truth magazine comparing books about pastoral ministry from the early church. So I was looking at Gregory the Great's pastoral rule, which is probably the most kind of fleshed out patristic understanding of pastoral ministry, and it became very much the handbook for pastoral ministry through the Middle Ages. When a bishop was ordained and installed as a bishop in the Middle Ages, he was given a copy of Gregory the Great's book. So it was kind of the paradigmatic summary of the church fathers. It set the tone for the Middle Ages, and I was comparing and contrasting Gregory the Great's book, The Pastoral Rule, with the reformer Martin Bucer's book concerning the true care of souls, which was kind of represented the way that the Reformation shifted and developed and evolved the understanding of pastoral ministry. So I was kind of doing some of that work. Well, behind that whole stream of writing, whether you're talking about Bucer or Gregory the Great or St. John Chrysostom or others, behind all of that is this book by Gregory of Nazianzus. This is kind of the first that I'm aware of extended exploration of what it means to be a pastor. And what you also find as you read this is that a lot of those later works are actually taking what Gregory of Nazianzus did and either just repeating it, same illustrations, same applications, same points and structure, or they're kind of fleshing it out and developing it further. So this is kind of the head streams for the church's thinking on pastoral ministry outside of the Bible. And Gregory has given the church a great gift in this book. What he does then, as he kind of explains why he left the ministry, is he basically says, I was overwhelmed with what it means to be a pastor, because it involves so much. And he fleshes that out in a variety of ways. First off, he talks about just the overwhelming weight of what you're called to be as a pastor. It's not just the difficulty of what you're called to do, it's the high bar that the scripture sets before us for the character of a man. And he sort of walks through that in great detail and talks about how a pastor has to be someone who is free of vice, so you have to overcome and subdue all of these passions and vices and sins that are so easily attached to us. And so there's this kind of negative work of clearing away or addressing those sins, but also how you have to be strong in virtue. You have to be this good example. You have to let your life reflect what your teaching is. And so there's this very high bar in terms of character, which was overwhelming to him. And then he talks at great length about the difficulty of what a pastor is called to do. And he uses a very famous analogy, which again, you'll see this running all through the literature as later thinkers will take up this same topic. Gregory says that a pastor is like a physician of the soul. That's how you should think about what it means to be a minister. You're not just to use our kind of terms, you're not just a life coach, you're not just a teacher or a professor, you're not just a counselor, you are to be a physician of the soul. And in the same way that a doctor has to understand how the body is supposed to work and the various sicknesses and illnesses and problems that a body can face and how to address those in all sorts of situations, he says that's what a pastor has to be able to do, to step into all sorts of people's lives and give them what they need. And it requires great learning, it requires great skill, and the stakes are very high. In fact, he says, when we come to a physician, we realize the stakes are high. It's life or death. It's the quality of life. Am I going to be healthy? Am I going to be sick? And so we realize there's a very high bar there for doctors. But Gregory makes the comment that for a pastor, it's even more so, because if a doctor does his job well, then that means your life is extended a little bit. But you will still eventually get sick. You will still eventually die. Your body will eventually decay. So you're kind of fighting a losing battle. And if the doctor gets it wrong, it might hasten your death, but it's hastening something that was already going to come anyways. So he's not downplaying the role of a doctor. In fact, his older brother was a doctor, interestingly enough, but he's saying that however important we realize doctors are, pastors have an even greater significance, because we're dealing not just with the body, which will die and decay, we're mortal, but with the soul, which is immortal. And if we are doing our trade well as pastors and caring for, as physicians of the soul, caring for people's souls, then they will dwell with God in eternity, the triune God himself. There's nothing more glorious. There's nothing more wonderful. That's what we're made for. And so the stakes are very high to get it right. And of course, if we get it wrong, it can be just as weighty, that we could be leading people away from God and to hell. And so Gregory, again, uses all sorts of illustrations to kind of draw this out, but at the end of the day, he feels insufficient. He feels insufficient in terms of what he's called to be, free of vice, strong in virtue, and insufficient in terms of what he's called to do, the care of souls. And then he talks about just the challenges and difficulties that are attached to the ministry and how difficult it is, again, to deal with different kinds of people. He says, as a physician of the soul, as a pastor, you're dealing with the most educated and the least educated, male, female, children, adults. The whole cross-section of humanity is your flock, your parish, and you're called to deal with them with wisdom and with grace. You have to know when to be strong, when to be soft, when to be bold, when to be humble and quiet, when to rebuke, when to encourage. And not everyone responds in the same way to the same things. And you're trying to deal with things that theologically and philosophically stretch the minds of the greatest thinkers, and yet you have to communicate that in a sermon to people who maybe have never encountered these ideas before. And so you've got to be able to, in your preaching, in your counsel, both speak to those who are furthest along in the faith, most mature, and those who are just beginning in the faith. It's a great challenge, and Gregory very much fleshes out the difficulty of that. He then goes through in a really exhaustive way and just goes through the different prophets. He goes to Hosea and Micah and Joel and Habakkuk and Malachi and Jeremiah. And he goes through all the prophets and shows how in all of the prophets, one of the running themes is the condemnation of unfaithful ministers, priests, prophets, and kings who fail to do what God called them to do, and the curses and punishment that God holds out for those who have been unfaithful. And so he says that's terrifying to think about the weightiness, again, that the scriptures put on getting this right. And he talks about, this was a fascinating section for me, and it gives you a flavor of his writing. It's very dynamic, it's very oratorical. This is a time of high rhetoric where people like Gregory are very gifted and skilled and well-trained in how to write well and how to speak well. And so I was reading one scholar who said, if you ever find yourself struggling with the Cappadocian Fathers, try reading it out loud, because sometimes it comes across rhetorically and with more power as you're reading it out loud, and you see the beauty of the language and the vividness of the illustrations. But Gregory's talking about how one of the challenges in his day, which sounds a lot like our day, is that you have all sorts of different opinions. And it's not just the church versus the world, but within the context of the church, there's all these either false teachings or kind of, to use our language, different tribes that are kind of fighting with each other. And it's so hard as a pastor to know, what do I speak into? What do I not speak into? As I'm engaged in these debates, who is an enemy that needs to be rebuked? Who is a friend who needs to be won? It's so disorienting, right? And I feel that in the internet age, but Gregory was feeling something like that in his own day as well. And so he says, everything has reverted to the original state of things before the world with its present fair order and form came into being. We're in this primeval chaos, he imagines. He says the general confusion and irregularity cry for some organizing hand and power. Or, if you will, it's like a battle at night by the faint light of the moon, when none can discern the faces of friends or foes, or like a sea fight on the surge, with the driving winds and boiling foam and dashing waves and crashing vessels, with the thrust of poles, the pipes of boatswains, the groans of the fallen, while we make our voices heard above the din, and not knowing what to do, and having, alas, no opportunity for showing our valor, assail one another, and fall by one another's hands. It's just amazing the way he describes, again, that kind of internal fighting that takes place in the church, and just the disorienting nature of being a pastor or a leader when that kind of thing is going on. To hear that, it sounds like a description of what pastors today are facing, and yet here it is in the 4th century. So there's just some wonderful, wonderful things in there. And where he kind of ends is he says, so for all these reasons, right, you think about what it means to be a pastor, I was overwhelmed. I was discouraged. I was terrified that I would mess things up. But then he went back to the prophet Jonah. So, he went through all those different prophets who were calling out false teachers or people who were not faithful to their calling. And then he said, I remember Jonah and how God dealt with him when he was unfaithful. And I realized I don't want to be a Jonah. And so he said, what I feel was caught between two things. On the one hand, caught between the fear of not being sufficient for the call, but on the other hand, the fear of not being obedient to a call that I actually had. And so here's how he ends. He says, the fear of disobedience overcame me and has carried me off. Pray, mark how accurately and justly I hold the balance between the fears, neither desiring an office not given to me, nor rejecting it when given. The one course marks the rash, and the other the disobedient, both the undisciplined. My position lies between those who are too bold or too timid, more timid than those who rush at every position, more bold than those who avoid them all, This is my judgment on the matter. And so he says, this is why I came back. Because at the end of the day, yes, I may be terrified that I'll mess up this call, but I also to be fearful of disobedience to the call. And so he ends with a really wonderful kind of, again, balance. He's trying to sort of set this before his people and set this before, other pastors and things to help you see the gravity and the weight of what it means to be a minister of the word, what it means to be a physician of the soul. And yet to also realize that God calls us to this, and so we have to be obedient. It's a wonderful work. It strikes at so many things that are perennially relevant for pastors. One thing I wish had come out more, and I think Gregory brings us right to the edge of this, but he doesn't go there, and I wish he had, would be to say that not only should we be fearful of being disobedient, but we should realize God himself is faithful. God is the one who works in and through us as pastors. We are all insufficient in our character, and we're all insufficient in our skill. I am overwhelmed. Every pastor should be overwhelmed when we think about what we're called to be as a minister and what we're called to do as a minister, and we should realize the weightiness of it. I think that's something that we can so often in our day kind of view pastors in a managerial way as a professional class, and it becomes just kind of like being a doctor, like being a lawyer, like being a businessman. It's not. It's something else. It's something more. And I think Gregory will give you that sense that there's something eternal and weighty and unique about the pastoral ministry. So it's very good on that front. What I think it underemphasizes is that as we minister as under-shepherds of Christ. Christ, the chief shepherd, is still at work. He's still caring for his flock. We're not going to mess up his plan, and he can work in and through us. One of the questions that I was asked when I was coming for my ordination was, how do you understand the ministry in light of your union with Christ? Which is a great question. And basically part of what they're trying to get you to understand and to draw out there is the fact that I'm united to Christ means that I have what I need when I minister. Not because I'm so good in my virtue, not because I've overcome all my vices. I think Gregory, reflecting his day, puts too much of an emphasis on kind of our purifying of ourselves. That's not my hope. It's that Christ, by his Spirit, is purifying me, is making me more like himself. And that as I go out to minister, as I go out to live, that I'm doing so in the perfect righteousness of Christ and with his perfect Spirit dwelling in me, who is even now perfecting me and sanctifying me. So I am not yet what I should be, not yet what I will be, but God is at work in me to make me like himself, and God can be at work through me and through other ministers and through other Christians to help each of us be more conformed to the image of his Son, Jesus Christ. So that's a theme that I wish there was a few more pages just kind of reminding us of that yes, this is overwhelming. Yes, it's beyond us, but it's not beyond God, and God will carry out his purposes through his Son, Jesus Christ, and through the body that he has called to himself. But with that in mind, if you have that theology at work, I think you would greatly profit, especially if you're a young pastor or a young man who's considering ministry. It'd be really worthwhile sitting down with an older Christian, sitting down with a more experienced pastor, and reading through Gregory of Nazianzus' second oration in defense of his flight to Pontus.